in the state of song, in a modest dwelling somewhere along a road that history has not bothered to remember, a man received a messenger and turned him away. The messenger had come with an offer. The offer was significant, a position of genuine power, the kind of appointment that drew philosophers out of their studies and into the courts where civilization was understood to be at stake. The era pressed such offers on anyone who showed signs of unusual intelligence, because the era believed it needed unusual intelligence and believed it needed it urgently. The man who answered the door was said to be a minor official, a lacquer tree garden overseer, someone who had demonstrated enough capacity for clear thought to attract the attention of those who collected such capacity and put it to use. He looked at the messenger. The road behind the messenger was dusty and long, running out toward the larger world that had sent him. The room behind the man who answered was modest and still. He declined. The messenger left down that dusty road. The room stayed quiet. And somewhere in the particular quality of that stillness, the deliberate choosing of poverty and intellectual freedom over utility and social appointment, there is already a philosophical position taking shape, one that this man would spend the rest of his life articulating through fables, through jokes, through stories about gnarled trees and dreaming butterflies, and cooks who had learned to cut through the joints of things with a knife that never dulled. His name, as the historical record eventually comes to hold it, was Zhuangzi. The tradition calls him Zhuangzi, the master Zhuang, and the particular kind of thinking he practiced, and the particular life he chose to live, are not fully separable from that moment at the door, the messenger, the offer, the room that stayed still. What Sima Chan records in the asterisk Shiji asterisk, that great inventory of lives and times completed near the end of the 1st century before the Common Era, is spare and not fully corroborated elsewhere, and the biographical details of Zhuangzi's life remain genuinely uncertain. The dates given are approximate. He likely lived between 369 and 286 BCE, though even this is a scholarly reconstruction rather than a firm fact. He was from Song, a small and not particularly powerful state in what is now central China. He held a minor administrative position at some point. He declined high office when it was offered on at least one recorded occasion. He wrote, or contributed substantially to, a body of work that survived him in some form and went on to influence Chinese thought across more than 2,000 years in ways that could not have been predicted from the modest room in which it was composed. These facts are few. They are also, in a certain way, enough, because what matters is the shape they make together. A man at the edge of power who chose the edge. A thinker in an era of urgent prescription who chose fable. A philosopher among philosophical schools competing to save civilization who chose to write about trees that refused to be useful. The life and the thought are oriented in the same direction, and that direction is toward a kind of freedom that could not be absorbed by any of the systems pressing on him from every side. The era pressing on him was genuinely turbulent. The Warring States period, which ran from approximately 475 to 221 BCE, was a long century of political fragmentation, 7 major kingdoms contending for dominance, alliances forming and dissolving, armies moving across agricultural land while farmers watched from distances, whole cities and lineages extinguished by the calculations of competing powers. From this distance, held at the height of historical overview, the violence reads as a landscape rather than an immediate condition. Its outlines are there, and its scale is evident, and its human weight is real. But it is not the violence of tonight or of any particular urgency that presses forward into the present. It is the texture of a past that shaped the minds that inhabited it without being able to step outside it and see its shape. What the Warring States period produced, in part because of its turbulence and in part in response to it, was an extraordinary efflorescence of philosophical thought that the tradition calls the 100 Schools, a name that gestures at multiplicity rather than counting exactly. The Confucians believed that social order could be restored through the cultivation of virtue, through ritual propriety, through the careful practice of benevolence and righteousness, and they addressed their thought primarily to rulers and to those who served rulers, proposing that the inner cultivation of the educated person was the ground from which good governance could grow. The modists believed that indiscriminate love and practical utility were the proper measures of all things, and they were skeptical of the elaborate ritual and aesthetic cultivation the Confucians prized, preferring what could be measured and distributed and shared without remainder. The legalists believed that law and punishment and strict administrative control were the only reliable instruments of order, and their thought would eventually find its most complete expression in the Qin dynasty's brutal unification of the warring kingdoms in 221 BCE, a unification that worked briefly and then collapsed under the weight of its own rigidity. And then there were the Daoists, though this category, like most categories, is looser and more contested than the name suggests. What binds them, if anything does, is a shared orientation toward the Tao, the way, the underlying current or pattern or ground of all things, and a shared skepticism toward the elaborate social constructions that the other schools were either trying to restore or refine or enforce. They did not agree among themselves on all things. They were not a school in the institutional sense, but they shared a suspicion of urgency, a preference for what is natural over what is constructed, and a belief that the noisiest responses to civilization's problems were often the least reliable. Laozi is the name the tradition attaches to the founding figure of this current, though the historical Laozi, if there was a single historical Laozi, is even more difficult to locate than the historical Zhuangzi. The text that bears his association, the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk, is a collection of 81 brief chapters, terse and aphoristic, each one a kind of concentrated point at which enormous pressure has been applied to language until it yields something denser than argument. The asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk speaks of the Tao, the way that cannot be named, the ground from which all things emerge and to which they return, and it speaks of asterisk Wu Wei asterisk, the principle of non-forcing action, of governing so lightly and so wisely that the people do not experience themselves as governed. Its primary addressee, if it has one, is the ideal ruler. It is a text about power and its proper use, about the kind of strength that does not announce itself, about the governance that achieves its ends by releasing rather than grasping. It is extraordinary, and it is also, in a certain way, still oriented toward the world it is trying to improve, still, in other words, offering something useful to those in positions of use. What Zhuangzi did with the philosophical foundation he inherited from this tradition is best understood not as elaboration or continuation, but as something more like radicalization, though that word carries its own urgencies, and the idea is better felt than named. The asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk had placed the Tao at the center and had proposed that wise governance would align itself with the Tao's own non-forcing movement. Zhuangzi took the Tao seriously as a metaphysical ground and then asked what it would mean, not for governance, but for individual consciousness, for the inner life of a person trying to move through a world that had more categories and demands than any individual could satisfy. He was less interested in how a ruler should govern and more interested in how a mind should see, and the answer he developed across the strange and playful and intellectually audacious chapters of the text that bears his name was that the mind should hold its categories lightly, should know that its perspectives are partial, should understand that the judgments it takes to be absolute, useful and useless, valuable and worthless, significant and trivial, are always made from somewhere, always limited by the particular scale and angle of the observer, and never capture the full picture that the Tao holds without judgment and without remainder. This is what scholars call perspectivalism, and it is one of the most distinctive features of Zhuangzi's philosophical contribution. The view holds that all conceptual categories, not just the ones that seem obviously contested, but the most apparently stable ones, including the distinction between good and bad, large and small, short-lived and long-enduring, are contextual and partial rather than absolute features of the world as it actually is. A mushroom that lives through a single morning knows nothing of the alternation of seasons. A chrysalis that endures one summer knows nothing of the deep cold that comes after. And a human being who lives 80 years knows nothing of the timescales on which mountains erode and coastlines shift and species appear and vanish. None of these perspectives is wrong. Each captures something real from the position it occupies. None of them taken alone is the whole. Zhuangzi is not, in developing this view, arguing for a simple relativism in which all views are equally true and none can be evaluated against any other. The Tao remains, in his thinking, a genuine metaphysical ground, something that actually is, and from which all perspectives emerge, and toward which philosophical wisdom can genuinely move. The point is not that there is no truth, but that no single perspective has it whole, and that the urgency with which any given perspective insists on its completeness is usually the most reliable sign that it is not complete. The mind that holds its view lightly, knowing that it sees from somewhere rather than from everywhere, is not a less reliable mind than the one that insists on the finality of its judgments. It is a more honest one, and in Zhuangzi's account, it is also a more alive one, less contracted around its own certainties, more open to the movement of things as they actually are. This philosophical position required a literary method suited to it, and Zhuangzi's choice of literary method is as distinctive as his philosophy. The text is not organized as systematic argument. It does not build toward conclusions in the way that a treatise builds, with premises stacked carefully toward a demonstration that arrives at the end and clinches the case. Instead, the text proceeds by accumulation, parable after parable, image after image, story after story, each one approaching the same central cluster of insights from a different angle, none of them pretending to be the definitive approach. The philosopher articulated this choice in terms that the tradition records and scholars have worked to reconstruct, describing what he called asterisk zuyan, asterisk goblet words, words that like a goblet, tip and fill and empty and tip again, never fixing themselves in a single stable position. And asterisk zuyan, asterisks weighty words, the voices of wise figures and ancient authorities to which the text gives space without endorsing entirely. And asterisk zuyan, asterisk spillover words or lodge-in words, the fables and parables in which a philosophical point is given to a character or a tree or a dream to carry, because a story can hold an idea in a way that a direct statement cannot, and because the indirection of parable acknowledges the instability of language more honestly than the directness of argument. This is not mere literary decoration. It is itself a philosophical position about how language works and how meaning moves. Zhuangzi understood that language, by its nature, tends to fix and categorize and divide, to take the continuous flow of the Tao and cut it into pieces that can be named and evaluated and arranged. He understood that this cutting is useful, even necessary, but also that it is always partial, always a simplification of something that will not be simplified without loss. The fable form carries this understanding built in. When Carpenter Shi dismisses a great tree, and the tree speaks back to him in his dream, the reader is not being given a proposition to evaluate. Something more like understanding is being invited, a kind of felt recognition that arrives before the analytical mind has organized it into a thesis. The indirection is the precision. The apparent looseness of the story is the most honest way of approaching what cannot be said directly without being said wrong. The text that carries all of this did not arrive whole and stable. What readers and scholars encounter as the asterisk Zhuangzi, asterisk is a composite, a gathering of voices across time, some closer to Zhuangzhou himself, and some more distant, arranged and organized, and substantially edited by a man named Guasheng in the 4th century of the Common Era, nearly 600 years after Zhuangzi's own lifetime. Guasheng sat before a text of 52 chapters and made decisions to include, to exclude, to arrange, that shaped the form in which every subsequent reader would encounter this philosophy. The text that survived his editing was 33 chapters, and the tradition divides these into 7 inner chapters, considered by modern scholarship to be most directly the work of Zhuangzi himself, and the outer and miscellaneous chapters, which carry related ideas but show signs of different hands, different emphases, different moments in the development of a broader current of thought. This distinction matters, and it matters not as scholarly pedantry, but as a genuine feature of what the text is. The 7 inner chapters, including the extraordinary 2nd chapter, the Qiwalun, and the 4th chapter, the Renjian Shi, where the useless tree parable lives, carry a particular density and philosophical coherence that the later chapters, for all their interest, do not quite replicate. To read the inner chapters is to be close to something specific, a particular mind, working in a particular moment, with a particular set of urgencies, in a way that reading the broader text does not always sustain. A.C. Graham, the 20th century scholar whose close textual work on the asterisk Zhuangzi asterisk remains among the most careful available, spent years working through the stylistic layers of the text, distinguishing hands and voices the way an archaeologist reads the strata in stone, each stratum deposited at a different time and telling a different part of the story. What he found was not a unified treatise, but a collaborative artifact, a text that had grown around a core of genuine philosophical originality, the way coral grows around a structure, accumulating over centuries into something that is simultaneously more and less than any single author could have planned. Graham at his desk in the 20th century, turning the ancient pages with scholarly patience, is in his own way a figure Zhuangzi would have recognized, someone working with what is given, trying to find the joints and contours of a text, the way Cook Ding found the joints and contours of the ox, moving through what has been given without forcing it into a shape it does not naturally hold. The work of scholarship and the work of philosophical understanding are, at their best, similar activities. Both require a kind of attention that does not impose itself on what it is attending to, that waits for the structure to become visible rather than cutting across it with the wrong kind of knife. Guosheng, making his editorial decisions in the 4th century, was not simply a custodian. He He was himself a philosopher, and his arrangement of the text reflects his own reading of what it contained, his own sense of what was central and what was peripheral. His choices persisted for 1700 years. The readers who came after him, in every dynasty, in every century of Chinese intellectual life, and eventually in translation across every major language in the world, encountered Zhuangzi through the frame Guosheng had made. This is the condition of all inherited thought. What we receive has always passed through other hands, and the hands have always left their mark, and the mark is part of what we receive. Zhuangzi, who was himself working with what Laozi had left and transforming it into something new, would presumably have found this continuity unsurprising and perhaps even fitting. Across the warring kingdoms of that ancient era, philosophers argued with urgency about how civilization should be saved. Their voices overlapped and competed. They sought appointments, gathered disciples, debated in the courts of kings. The sound of their argument was the dominant sound of the philosophical world they inhabited, urgent, purposeful, aimed. And somewhere at the edge of all this noise, a man in a modest dwelling in the state of song wrote fables about gnarled trees and rejected offers, and the quality of understanding that only becomes available when the purposeful mind goes quiet enough to hear what the dreaming mind can receive. He was not indifferent to his era. His philosophy was, in a deep sense, a response to his era, a response to the particular form of urgency that his era had taken, to the pressing of every intelligent person into the service of one system or another, to the assumption that philosophy's proper role was to rescue civilization from its own turbulence. His response was not to join the argument, but to step back far enough to question the frame in which the argument was being conducted, to ask whether the categories, useful and useless, important and trivial, significant and dispensable, through which everyone was organizing their responses to the world, were themselves reliable, or whether they were something more like perspectival habits, convincing from within, but partial in ways that only showed up when the perspective shifted. The text he produced or contributed to or inspired, the line of attribution, is genuinely uncertain, and the uncertainty is itself characteristic of how Zhuangzi thought about the fixity of categories, is a strange and ungovernable object. It is not a treatise, it is not a collection of sayings, it is not a theological text, or a manual of governance, or a guide to ethical life in the Confucian mode. It has been classified as literature, and as philosophy, and as religious thought, and as something that requires a new category, and it has survived each classification without being contained by any of them. The Confucians found elements of it useful and other elements incompatible. The Buddhist traditions that entered China in the early centuries of the Common Era found resonances in it and incorporated some of its vocabulary and images. The Neo-Taoist thinkers of the Wei-Jin period took it as a central text. The Chan Buddhist tradition drew from it. Poets used it. Painters used it. Political thinkers used it. And across all these uses, the text remained available for more, ungovernable in the sense of resisting final appropriation by any single tradition or system, the way the useless tree at the shrine resists the carpenter by offering nothing the carpenter can take. There is something in this, in the way the text survived by being unclassifiable, by being useful to many things without being owned by any of them, that is already a version of the philosophy it contains. The tree that no carpenter could use grew old and vast, while every useful tree around it was cut down and carried away. The text that no dynasty or school could fully claim survived every dynasty and outlasted every school, accumulating readers across millennia in ways that the more orderly and purposeful philosophical systems did not always manage. Whether this is meaningful or merely coincidental is a question that the text itself, in its characteristic manner, would decline to answer definitively, and would probably find the declining more instructive than any answer could be. What arrives to a reader opening these pages, any reader, in any century, whether in the original classical Chinese, or in Graham's carefully cadenced translations, or in any of the other scholarly attempts to carry the text across the distance between its world and ours, is not a doctrine to be learned, or a position to be adopted. It is more like an invitation to a particular kind of seeing. The invitation does not arrive with urgency. It does not press. It tells stories about gnarled trees and dreaming men, and cooks who move through an animal structure with a knife that never dulls, and it allows the reader to receive whatever the stories make available to them in this moment, in this reading, from wherever they are looking. The text exists. Wait, it has existed across many centuries, carrying its cluster of insights through many hands, many readings, many misreadings, many moments of partial understanding, and many moments of genuine encounter. It is a composite of many voices. Daoist's own, closest to the surface in the 7 inner chapters, and others gradually further away, brought into relation with the core by editors and compilers who found in the whole something worth preserving. It is, in Guosheng's arrangement, 33 chapters that have traveled from the 4th century BCE to the present moment by being neither fully useful to any single system nor fully ignorable by any of them. It is, in short, the kind of object that survives precisely because no single hand could fully possess it, the kind of object that the philosophy inside it seems in some quiet way to have anticipated. The room in the state of song, after the messenger left, was still. That stillness had something in it, not emptiness, but a quality of holding, the particular quality of a space from which urgency has been gently declined and has not yet returned. In that stillness, something began to be written. It was written in fragments and in fables and in the voices of carpenters and trees and dreaming men who are also butterflies. It was gathered and arranged by people who came after. It crossed centuries in forms that no single person fully controlled, and it arrived ungovernable and unclassifiable and patient as an old tree at the edge of a shrine, still carrying within it the question it had always been asking about what is actually valuable and what is actually wasted, and whether the categories through which a person navigates their life are as stable and reliable as the urgency of living makes them feel. The text cannot be fully owned. This is the condition of its survival, and the condition of its survival is quietly the first thing it has to teach, that what cannot be consumed cannot be exhausted, and that what offers nothing to the hand that would take it remains in its own terms whole. Carpenter Shi and his apprentice were walking a road in the state of song, moving through the long warm middle of a country afternoon, when the apprentice stopped. He had stopped because the tree stopped him. It stood at a bend in the road beside a village shrine, an oak or something older than any name usually given to oaks, and its canopy spread so wide that thousands of oxen could have rested in its shade without touching one another at the edges. Its trunk rose in thick, twisted columns, the kind of trunk that requires a full company of grown men standing arm to arm to encircle. Its branches curved back against each other and then out again, broad as smaller trees themselves, each one as large as a beam a carpenter would be grateful to find. The bark was dark and deeply grooved, the kind of bark that takes generations to accumulate, and the shade it cast over the shrine, and the road, and the dry ground for some distance in every direction, was not the thin, movable shade of an afternoon, but something closer to a permanent local weather. The apprentice stood at the base of it, head tilted back, looking up at the place where the branches divided, and divided again into a lattice of green, so dense that it held the sky in small pieces. Carpenter She had not stopped. He was already 10 yards past the tree before he heard the silence behind him and understood that his apprentice had fallen behind. He turned briefly, saw the boy standing at the trunk with his head tilted back, and then he turned away again and kept walking. There was work to be done in the next village. There were real trees to evaluate, timber that could be cut, shaped, joined, used for something. What the shrine oak was good for, he could say in a single sentence: nothing. It was porous wood, pithy at the center. A boat made from it would sink. A coffin would rot through. A beam would crack. A tool made from it would wear out before the tool was needed twice. It was, by every standard a carpenter lived by, a waste of the ground it occupied and the water it drank. The apprentice would catch up. The apprentice always caught up. That is how the parable begins, in the 4th chapter of the Zhuangzi. In the gap between a master who knows what things are worth and a student who has momentarily forgotten to ask. The chapter bears a title that might be translated as In the Human World, and the tree at its center is exactly that, something in the human world, surrounded by human purposes, evaluated by human standards, and found by those standards completely wanting. Carpenter She's dismissal is not cruelty, it is not ignorance, it is the ordinary operation of a practical mind that has learned to see the world efficiently, to distinguish the valuable from the worthless, to move through the landscape selecting what can serve and passing over what cannot. He is good at his work, his knife is sharp, his eye for timber is practiced and reliable. And none of this, Zhuangzi is very quietly proposing, is the same thing as knowing what the tree is. The night after the journey, Carpenter She dreamed. In the dream, the sacred oak appeared before him and spoke. The tree did not appear as the carpenter had seen it on the road, as an object to be assessed from the outside, as a volume of wood awaiting evaluation. In the dream, the tree was present the way a person is present, with an interior, with a perspective, with things it had observed over its long life, and had been waiting for the right silence in which to say them. In the carpenter's sleeping mind, freed from the forward movement of the day's purposes, from the road and the next village, and the work to be done, was finally quiet enough to hear it. The tree's argument was not angry. The parable does not give the oak any emotion resembling grievance, and this matters. What the tree offers the carpenter in the dream is something closer to patient instruction, the kind given by a being who has had a great deal of time to think and who has no particular stake in whether the thinking is received. The tree has seen many carpenters. It has seen many afternoons. The argument it makes is one it has been making, in its own way, simply by continuing to stand. The tree asked the carpenter to consider the other trees, the pear, the orange, the citron, the catalpa, the boxwood, all the trees that carpenters stop to examine, that craftsmen select, that farmers tend and harvest. What happens to them, the tree asked, because of their usefulness? The pear is stripped of its fruit before the fruit is ready to fall on its own terms. The citrus trees are pulled and shaken, and their branches broken for the harvest. The fine timber trees are felled in their youth, before they have had time to become what they might have been. They are planed and joined and made into floors and boats and tools, their substance extracted and converted, and deployed in the service of purposes they did not choose and cannot share. Useful, the tree said, or something the dream rendered as useful, means being usable, and being usable means being available to be used up. This is the center of the argument, and it is worth staying near it for a moment, turning it slowly rather than moving past it. What the tree is doing, what Zhuangzi is doing through the tree, is not simply praising uselessness as better than usefulness. The inversion is more careful than that. The useful tree does not die because it is bad or unlucky or small. It dies because it is good, because it is desirable, because the very qualities that make it valuable to the carpenter are the qualities that ensure it will be cut down before it grows old. Its beauty is the instrument of its diminishment. Its virtue, in the carpenter's terms, is the condition of its early end. And what the sacred oak has discovered over the centuries of growing large and gnarled and pithy, while the timber trees around it were harvested and carried away, is that what the carpenter's framework calls deficiency is, when the full span of a life is considered, the only reliable protection against the violence of being found excellent. The dream oak in chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi calls this deliberate. It says that it has long cultivated its uselessness, that this is not an accident of nature, but something it understands as a strategy. Though strategy is perhaps too calculated a word for what the tree describes, which is closer to a philosophical self-knowledge applied to the problem of survival. The tree knows what it is. It knows what it is not. It has grown old and enormous by understanding the difference between what it is, in its own terms, and what it would need to be in order to satisfy the carpenter's framework, and by having, somewhere in its long and unspoken life, refused the second in favor of the first. There is something in this that Zhuangzi takes seriously in a way that distinguishes him from the simpler pleasures of paradox. He is not merely turning the argument upside down and inviting the listener to admire the flip. He is proposing that the useful and the useless exist in an asymmetrical relationship to time. Usefulness is an extraction. It draws on a thing's nature and spends it toward an external purpose. A beam is useful once, while it holds up the structure it was made for. After that, it decays in service, or is replaced, or is burned. The sacred oak is useless across all the same time, and has, at the end of the parable, lost nothing. It remains. Its wood is still there. Its shade is still there. Its roots still spread in every direction through the soil of the shrine. The accumulation of its nature is intact, because nothing has arrived to spend it. And this intactness, this unspent completeness, is what Zhuangzi points to with a kind of philosophical care that the word useless does not by itself quite contain. The carpenter's apprentice, standing at the tree's base on the road, had not yet learned to see the way his master saw. He did not know enough yet to dismiss the tree efficiently, and so he stood, head tilted back, held in an attention that his training had not yet organized into judgment. And what he was experiencing in that moment, before the categories arrived to tell him what the tree was worth, was something close to what Zhuangzi thinks seeing actually is, before it is disciplined into use. But it is the dream that carries the weight of the parable's argument. The staging of the tree's speech as a dream is not a convenience or a literary flourish. Zhuangzi had thought carefully about what dreams are and what they permit. In the same text, in the famous image of the butterfly, he had sat with the question of whether the categories of waking and dreaming are as secure as the waking mind supposes. The waking mind is organized by purposes. It moves through the world selecting what is useful, dismissing what is not, building the present moment toward an anticipated future. This forward lean, this purposive tilt, is both the great competence of practical consciousness and its great limitation because it can only encounter the world in the terms that its purposes have set up in advance. What cannot be used cannot be attended to. What cannot be attended to cannot be known, and the tree at the shrine, dismissed in the space of a passing glance by a master who knew immediately what it was worth, is the clearest possible illustration of what the purposive mind's efficiency costs. The dream dissolves the purposive tilt. In sleep, the forward lean of the waking mind releases, and what it releases is the capacity to be approached. Not to approach, the dreaming mind does not go out and gather experience, but to be approached, to receive what the waking mind's efficient movement through the world would never have slowed down enough to receive. And in this specific parable, what comes in the absence of the carpenter's waking purposes is the argument the tree has been carrying all along, the patient, long-developed philosophical argument of a being that has had centuries to think, and that has been waiting for the moment when the mind in front of it would finally go quiet enough to listen. The parable grants the tree a voice. This is not a small gesture. In the carpenter's waking world, the tree is matter. It is a volume of wood with properties that can be measured and evaluated. It has no interiority, no perspective, no claims on the conversation. The hierarchy of the waking world places the evaluating human on one side and the evaluated material on the other, and between them runs a sharp line. The tree is on the wrong side of that line to have anything to say, and yet in the dream, Zhuangzi moves the tree to the other side, gives it a voice, gives it a history, gives it an argument that is more philosophically developed than anything the carpenter has said, and in doing so dissolves, with great gentleness and without fanfare, the sharp line that the waking world insists on. The tree's argument is the argument of something that has been on the receiving end of the carpenter's framework for its entire life, and that has, in the course of that life, developed a thoroughgoing understanding of that framework that the carpenter himself lacks. The carpenter knows how to evaluate trees. The tree knows what it means to be evaluated, and what it costs, and what the alternative is, and how long the alternative takes to grow. This is not the reversal of a hierarchy. Exactly. It is more like a recognition that the hierarchy was never as stable as the carpenter's efficient morning walk had suggested, that the thing which was dismissed contained more than the dismissal assumed. Zhuangzi is doing something here that he does throughout the inner chapters. He is giving weight and interiority and philosophical significance to what the dominant frameworks of his world had classified as, without weight, interiority, or significance. The crooked and the gnarled, the strange and the misshapen, the things that fall outside the categories of the useful, the beautiful, the socially recognized, and the morally celebrated. He places his deepest arguments in these figures, in these marginal and overlooked beings, and has them speak with a patience and a depth that the celebrated figures in the Confucian gallery of sages do not quite match. The pear tree, consider it one more time, in its full productivity. It stands in an orchard. It is well shaped, well tended, carefully cultivated. Its fruit comes in the right season and is sweet and abundant. Farmers praise it, merchants value it, children reach for it. Every virtue the orchard tradition knows how to name, the pear tree has. And every spring when the fruit appears, it is taken, shaken loose, carried off, converted into something else, the tree itself pruned back to make next year's harvest larger and better shaped, and more efficiently useful. The pear tree does not grow old in the way the sacred oak has grown old. Its energy is redirected constantly, channeled toward the external purpose of the harvest, spent in the service of something beyond itself. What it becomes in the end is the sum of its yields. There is a kind of completeness in that. Zhuangzi does not deny it. He is not arguing that the pear tree's life is without meaning, or that it has wasted itself. He is pointing at a different kind of completeness, the completeness of the thing that has been permitted to become, fully and without interruption, what it is. The sacred oak has no yield to speak of. No one harvests it. No one shapes it or prunes it or directs its growth toward any purpose but its own. And so it has grown in the direction of its own nature, through all the seasons of all the years of all the generations that came and went at the shrine, while it continued to stand, outward and upward and downward into the soil, following no plan but the one encoded in its own deepest character, answering to nothing but the sky and the rain and the long, slow pull of whatever the earth wanted it to be. This is what the carpenter walking past had no way to see. His framework of value, honed by years of honest craft, genuinely useful for the work he did in the world, was a framework built for extraction. It could identify what could be taken and what could be done with what was taken. What it could not see was the value of what remained when nothing was taken, because nothing in the framework pointed there. The sacred oak was a blank in his perceptual field, a gap in the map of the useful world. Not because the tree was not there, but because the categories he carried gave him no way to register what was there, which was something very old, very large, very complete, and entirely beyond what the category of uselessness could contain. When Carpenter Shi woke from his dream, the morning was already pale in the window. He lay still for a moment, a man in the ordinary attitude of a man who has slept and is not yet back in the full grip of the day. What the parable describes at this point is not a conversion. It does not say that the carpenter rose and returned to the shrine and stood beneath the great tree and understood everything. It does not resolve so cleanly, and Zhuangzi was far too honest a writer to reach for that kind of ending. What the carpenter carries out of the dream is something less definable and more real, a loosening in the certainty that had walked past the tree without pausing, a small alteration in the way the world held itself together around the edges of the useful and the not useful. The apprentice was asked, in the parable, what he made of the dream. He said, if the tree is so determined to be useless, what is it doing serving as a sacred tree? Even the boy who stood staring at the trunk on the road was not quite free of the utilitarian question, had found another use for the tree, another way to measure it, another service it was apparently providing by standing at the shrine and being impressive. And the tree's answer, which the parable gives as the carpenter's dream recollection rather than a new dream, is that this too is a misunderstanding, that the tree had not chosen to serve as a sacred tree, had not cultivated its enormity in order to be venerated, but that the veneration was simply another way of being seen through the lens of utility, and that the tree's actual relationship to its own existence had nothing to do with either the carpenter's dismissal or the villager's reverence. Both the useful evaluation and the reverential one were still looking at the tree from the outside, still fitting it into a human category. The tree's own ground was elsewhere. It was somewhere the categories had not reached. To say that the tree is useless is still to use the language of use. It is still to stand outside the tree and measure it against an external standard and note the distance between the tree and that standard. Zhuangzi is aware of this. The parable is aware of it. The word useless in the title of this meditation is a starting point, not a destination, a provisional term that points in the direction of something the language of usefulness and uselessness cannot finally say. What the tree is, in its own nature, in its own fullness, in the long life it has lived by the shrine, while the timber trees were cut down and carried away, is not capturable in either category. It exceeds the framework, and what the dream permits, what sleep permits, what the dissolution of the purposive waking mind permits, is a momentary approach to what the tree is before the framework arrives to classify it. The carpenter knew timber. He had been learning timber his entire working life, and his knowledge was real and hard won and not a small thing. His knife was sharp because he had kept it sharp through years of honest use. His eye for grain and density and the structural integrity of a plank was the accumulated result of countless mornings of careful work. None of this was false. None of it was worthless. None of it was worthless. But it was a knowledge organized by the question of what wood could be made to serve, and in the answer to that question, in the efficient, practiced, reliable answer, lay the border beyond which the knowledge could not go. On the other side of that border stood the great tree at the shrine, ancient and unharvested, and speaking in dreams, carrying in its long useless life an argument that the carpenter's sharpest knife could not cut open. The apprentice on the road had stood at that border for a moment, held there by something he could not name, before his training called him forward and the afternoon continued. He had not understood what stopped him. He probably did not remember it clearly by the time the next village was reached and the work began. But for a moment on the road, in the warm middle of the afternoon, he had stood at the base of something enormous and old and apparently empty of value, and had not been able to walk past. There is a kind of knowledge in that stopping. It does not know what it knows. It has no argument to make, no dream to articulate, no philosophical framework to place around itself. It is simply the body's refusal to dismiss without pausing, the animal attention that persists in the young craftsman before the craft has fully organized his seeing. Zhuangzi gives the deepest argument to the tree. He gives the initial seeing to the boy. He gives the dream, the hard-won loosening, to the master. And he gives the reader, the listener, the one lying in the dark in some other century, the slow recognition that all three moments are related, that the boy's wordless stopping and the master's dream argument and the tree's patient centuries of growth are not three different things, but the same thing seen from different distances, and that what they share is a quality of attention, animal in the boy, released in the dream, accumulated over lifetimes in the tree, that the purpose of waking mind, organized by the urgencies of the useful world, has a great deal of difficulty sustaining. The tree does not ask for anything at the end of the dream. It does not request that the carpenter return, or that the apprentice stop more often, or that anyone rethink the category of usefulness on its behalf. It is not making a demand. The argument it makes is the argument of something that has already arrived at what it needed to say, has always already said it by continuing to grow, has been speaking in the language of its own existence for centuries before the carpenter ever walked down that road. The dream is simply the moment when the argument enters a medium, the sleeping human mind, that can, however briefly and however partially, receive it. The night passes. The dream holds its shape through the small hours of the early morning, and then, in the way of dreams, it softens at the edges. The argument the tree made with such patient precision in the dark begins, as the light strengthens, to feel less like a fixed proposition and more like a quality, a particular kind of looseness in the certainty that had walked past the great tree without slowing, not a conclusion the carpenter could write down and hand to his apprentice, not a principle he could apply to the next grove of timber trees he passed. Something less teachable than that, and perhaps more durable. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the village shrine, the tree stood in the early stillness of the morning. It was not waiting for the carpenter to return with a changed mind. It was not arranging itself to be appreciated. In the hour before the day's foot traffic began, in the time before the village woke, and the road filled with the ordinary sounds of people moving between purposes, the great oak at the shrine was doing what it had been doing for longer than the shrine itself had stood, growing downward into the dark soil, growing outward into the air, following its own slow nature in every direction simultaneously, producing nothing that could be harvested, offering nothing that could be spent, and remaining, in its complete and unexhausted wholeness, exactly what it was. The shade it cast moved slowly across the ground as the light strengthened and the sun began its arc. The shade was not offered, it was simply the natural consequence of something very large continuing to exist. Anyone who sat within it would find it cool and deep and wide enough for everything they had brought with them, but the tree had no plan for them. It had no category in which to place the resting traveler or the praying villager or the carpenter's apprentice who had once stood at its base with his head tilted back. It was not a sacred tree by its own intention. It was not a useless tree by its own assessment. It was, and this is the word the parable is always reaching toward, without quite arriving at, simply and completely itself, in the long morning, in the early stillness, in the unhurried light. In the royal kitchen, after the work was done, Cook Ding set down his cleaver. The court had gone quiet without meaning to. Prince Hui was there, and his attendants, and the various officials whose days had brought them past that doorway, and all of them had, by degrees, stopped what they were doing and stood watching in a silence they had not planned. The cleaver rested on the wooden block. The work was complete. What they had witnessed had not looked like labor. Exactly. It had looked like something else, something for which the ordinary kitchen did not often call for a word. Cook Ding stood in the stillness he had made. His hands were at rest. Around him, the carcass lay opened with a precision that seemed less like cutting than like disclosure, less like force applied than like a natural structure, finally made visible to eyes that had not seen it before. There had been no sound of resistance, no grinding of blade against bone, only the quiet movement of a man who had learned, over a long life of attention, exactly where the spaces were. Prince Hui said it was the finest thing he had seen. He asked the cook how such skill was possible. Cook Ding said something that has been considered carefully ever since. He said that what he practiced was not skill, exactly, not in the way that word is usually meant. He said that what he followed was the Tao, which is something beyond mere technique. He said that when he first began cutting oxen, he saw before him a whole animal. After 3 years, he said, he no longer saw the whole animal. And now, after a working life spent in this practice, he moved through the natural structure of the animal by something closer to mind than to hand, following the grain and the cavity and the joint, guiding his blade through the spaces that were already there. His knife was 17 years old. Its edge had not dulled, because it had never met resistance where resistance was real. This is the story Zhuangzi placed in the 3rd chapter of the text that carries his name, in a section called The Secret of Caring for Life. It is a brief story. A cook, a prince, a kitchen, a cleaver, and inside that plainness, an argument so patient in its structure that it does not announce itself as an argument at all. It simply shows a man who has found a way of being in the world that does not exhaust itself, and it invites whoever is paying attention to sit with what has just been shown, for as long as that sitting takes. The idea that moved through that kitchen, through that cleaver, through that long life of careful practice, is the idea that has been called Wu Wei, 2 characters. The first means without, or absence of. The second means doing, or acting, or the effortful application of a self toward a purpose. Together they mean something like unforced action, or effortless movement, or action in which the boundary between the actor and the acted upon has grown so thin it is barely there. They are not a definition, they are a direction, and the direction they point toward is the place where Cook Ding was standing when he set down his cleaver in a kitchen that had gone quiet around him. The concept did not originate with Zhuangzi. It came to him through Laozi, through the small and ancient text called the Tao Te Ching, which had set down the essential vocabulary of the Tao before Zhuangzi was born. Laozi had written about Wu Wei, primarily as a principle of governance, the ideal ruler who leads so lightly, so invisibly, that the people believe they have governed themselves. The sage king acts without acting, he speaks without commanding. The work is done, and no one knows quite who did it, and this is presented as the highest form of political achievement, the governance that leaves no mark except the good it makes. Zhuangzi received this inheritance and carried it somewhere the Tao Te Ching had not quite gone. He took the principle out of the court and into the kitchen, out of governance and into the body, out of political philosophy and into the lived interior of a person learning, across years and failures and gradual refinements of attention, how to move through a world that is always more particular and more intricate than any idea of it can hold. The cook's insight is not a metaphor for good governance. It is an account of what a human being can become when the self that once stood between the person and the work has over time grown transparent. The question Zhuangzi was pressing at, in that kitchen, and throughout the chapters that bear his name, is a question about the nature of knowledge. Not knowledge in the sense of information accumulated and held, not the scholar's library, the official's files, the philosopher's collected arguments, but knowledge in the sense of a living relationship between a practitioner and the world they inhabit. Cook Ding knew the ox, not through anatomical study, though perhaps he had that too. He knew it the way the water knows the stone, by long contact, by yielding, by the patient discovery of what is actually there, rather than the imposition of what was expected to be there. When the cleaver entered the natural cavities, it was not cutting so much as following, and following in this sense requires something that cutting does not. It requires the willingness to be guided by the structure of the thing itself, rather than pressing through it according to a plan made elsewhere. The plan, the prior intention, the concept held in the mind before the hands move, these are the things that cause the knife to dull, the ox to resist, the cook to labor. The cook who has put all that aside moves differently, more quietly, with a kind of ease that is not carelessness, but its opposite, the deepest possible care, expressed as the absence of force. This is where Wu Wei begins to feel, to a mind still accustomed to the vocabulary of effort and achievement, like something almost impossible to name correctly. It can sound like laziness, like the permission to do nothing and call it philosophy. This is the misunderstanding that the parable is designed, with great gentleness, to correct. The cook has not given up. He has not withdrawn from the work. His 17 years of practice are in every movement. What he has released is not the engagement, but the friction of a self insisting on its own methods against the grain of the world's actual structure. What he has found, on the other side of all that released friction, is not rest in the ordinary sense. It is the highest possible form of being at work, in which the work moves through him rather than against him, and the ox opens rather than resists, and the kitchen goes quiet around him without his having tried to make it quiet. The hunchbacked man who catches cicadas is another figure from these chapters, less celebrated than the cook, but no less carefully placed. He stands in the forest in the early morning, his pole extended, his whole attention gathered to a single point. His body is crooked. His posture is nothing a Confucian text would hold up as a model of cultivated bearing. And yet, from this particular figure, from this body that the world of proper appearances would turn away from, comes a practice of attention so pure that the cicadas land on his pole as willingly as they land on a branch. When he is asked how he achieves this, he describes what has happened to his mind. He began with practice on clay balls, learning to balance one on the tip of the pole, then two, then three, until the balancing required nothing, was simply what his body did. Then he went into the forest and stood, and in the standing, everything fell away. He did not think about the rewards the cicadas might bring him. He did not think about whether his posture was correct or his methods approved. He stood in the forest with his body as still as a dead tree, his arm extended like a branch, and the world of winged things settled on him as it settles on anything that has become, in the relevant sense, indistinguishable from the world. This is what Zhuangzi means when he says the skill has moved past skill, and the self has moved past the self. The hunchbacked man is not performing stillness. He has stopped performing. And it is exactly this cessation, not an act of will, but the end of the will's interference, that makes the cicadas come. Force them with a net, and they scatter. Approach them with a self-conscious and purposeful stillness, and they scatter. Become, through whatever long interior journey it takes, genuinely indifferent to anything but the quality of this moment's attention, and the world in its various forms stops being startled by the approach. There is a word that floats behind all of this, present in Laozi and carried forward through Zhuangzi's elaborations. The word is ziran, which is usually translated as naturalness or spontaneity, or sometimes as self-so, the quality of being exactly what one is without effort, without the addition of anything unnecessary, without the gap between the thing and its expression. Water is ziran. It does not decide to be wet, or to seek the lowest place, or to take the shape of whatever contains it. It does not study these behaviors or practice them or perform them for an audience. It simply is what it is, and in being simply that, without remainder, it accomplishes what force and rigidity cannot. Laozi wrote about water in the Tao Te Ching with a patience that returns to it again and again, as though the image were bottomless enough to carry any amount of looking. Water seeks the low places that others disdain. It does not contend, and yet there is nothing that contends with it successfully over time. The hardest stone, pressed against long enough by the softest water, eventually gives, not because the water attacked, but because the water kept moving, kept yielding to every obstacle, never insisting on its own form, never holding its own shape against the shape offered to it. And in this long, patient, absolutely non-resistant movement, the canyon opens, the stone is worn, the valley is made. Zhuangzi takes this image and makes it personal, makes it interior, makes it a description not just of rivers and their banks, but of the quality of attention a mind can cultivate over a long period of serious, unhurried practice. The mind that has learned to move like water through the structure of a problem, not forcing, not insisting on its prior categories, not pressing its own logic against the grain of what is actually there. This mind arrives at understanding the way the river arrives at the sea, not through conquest, through patient, persistent, non-resistant movement that follows the actual shape of the world. This is not a counsel of passivity. The river is not passive. It is in motion every moment. It works in the sense that it changes everything it touches and is changed by everything it touches in return. The difference between the river and the stone in the flood is not that the river does not move and the stone does. The difference is in the quality of their movement, the stone displaced by force, the river moving through its own nature, the river being exactly what it is at every moment of its being, and by that complete self-enactment, achieving what the stone, even in its great density, cannot. For Zhuangzi, the person who has found Wu Wei has found something like this, not stillness in the sense of not moving, but the deeper stillness of a life moving in full accord with its own nature, without the friction of a self that is always slightly elsewhere, slightly ahead in its planning, slightly behind in its regret, always at some angle to the moment that is actually happening. The cook, the cicada catcher, the swimmer in fast water who moves with the current rather than against it, these are figures of the same interior condition, expressed in different contexts, different bodies, different skills. What they share is the absence of that gap between the self and what the self is doing, the gap through which effort leaks and resistance builds, and the knife grows dull. Zhuangzi was not content to let this remain a counsel of individual perfection. The deepest reach of Wu Wei is not merely that a person becomes more effective at what they do, though in the Cookding story, the prince is clearly moved by the sheer excellence of what he has witnessed. The deeper claim is that the mode of action changes. What is being done when Wu Wei is achieved is not the same kind of thing as what is done by effort and calculation and the imposition of prior intention. It is not a more efficient version of the same act. It is a different act entirely, one in which the practitioner has become something more like a medium than an agent, in which the Tao moves through the cook as the light moves through water, not constrained by the water, not fighting the water, but moved and shaped and dispersed by the water in a way that produces something that neither the light alone nor the water alone could produce. This is a difficult idea to hold without making it sound mystical in a vague and undemanding way. Zhuangzi was not interested in vague mysticism. He was interested in something precise and difficult, and arrived at only through long practice and honest attention. The mystical, for him, was not a shortcut past the practical. It was the destination of a very long practical road, at the end of which the practitioner discovers that the categories they started with, self and world, skill and nature, action and non-action, no longer divide quite as cleanly as they once seemed to. Cookding had worked for years before the whole ox ceased to present itself as a whole ox. The hunchbacked cicada catcher had practiced balance on clay balls before the forest became his body's natural habitat. The swimmer in the fast water, another figure from these texts, unremarked and easy to pass over, says simply that he learned to swim by entering with the current and leaving with the current, taking no thought for himself. But he did not know how to swim when he first entered. He learned. The learning was real, and at the end of it, what he found was not something he had constructed, but something the water had always been offering, that he was now able to receive. This is where Zhuangzi's treatment of Wu Wei parts ways, quietly but decisively, with the Confucian program that surrounded him and that his work was perpetually in conversation with. Confucius and his followers had built a philosophy of deliberate cultivation, the daily self-examination, the careful study of ritual and propriety, the conscious effort to become a person of virtue through repeated correct behavior shaped by correct study and correct relationship. Humanness was to be worked toward. Righteousness was to be practiced. The superior person, the Zhuangzi, was an achievement, something made over a lifetime of earnest effort and sustained attention to the forms of right conduct. Zhuangzi did not dismiss effort, but he observed something that the Confucian program, in its earnestness, tended to obscure. The person who is visibly, effortfully trying to be virtuous has already marked the distance between where they are and where they feel they ought to be. Conscious moral effort announces a gap, and while the gap is being consciously worked at, there is always the possibility, which Zhuangzi considered more than a possibility, that the effort itself becomes the performance, that the forms of right conduct become a kind of armor, and that the spontaneous natural virtue that the forms were meant to cultivate has been in some quiet way substituted for rather than nourished. He made the point with the kind of analogy he favored. Medicine appears when health has already departed. Rites of mourning appear when natural grief has already been complicated by social expectation. The conscious cultivation of virtue appears when the natural ease of acting rightly has already been lost, or has not yet been found, or has been crowded out by the proliferating demands of a civilization that keeps inventing new categories of correct and incorrect. The appearance of the cure signals the presence of the disease. This does not mean the cure should not be taken. It means that the cure and the original health are not the same thing and should not be confused. What Zhuangzi was pointing toward, past the deliberate cultivation of virtue and past the performance of correct conduct, was something he thought came before these, not historically before them, but structurally prior, the way the joint is prior to the knife and the space prior to the blade. He called it by various names in various parables. Sometimes it appears as the Tao moving through a person. Sometimes it appears as Da, the inherent character or potency of a thing, its way of being completely itself, without addition or subtraction. Sometimes it appears as the quality of the sage who has so thoroughly dissolved the boundary between the self's agenda and the world's actual shape that the sage's actions no longer feel, from the inside, like actions at all. The wheelwright peon, whom Zhuangzi said in conversation with Prince Hui in another passage, cuts through this directly. The prince is reading a text of ancient wisdom, and the old wheelwright asks him what he is reading. The words of sages, the prince says. Dead men's words, says the wheelwright. And he explains, with the patience of a man who has spent his life understanding the gap between the speakable and the known, that what makes a wheel right, the exact pressure of the chisel, the exact feel of the wood yielding or resisting, the knowledge that lives in the hands and in the body's long memory, cannot be put into a text. He has tried to pass it to his son. He cannot. The knowledge lives where it lives, and where it lives is not in language. He is not dismissing language. He is noting its limit. The text the prince is reading may be valuable, but the knowledge the sages had, the knowledge that made them sages, was not the knowledge that could be written down. It was the knowledge that Cook Ding had in his hands, that the cicada catcher had in his body, that the swimmer had in his relationship to the current. It was a knowledge built from years of honest, patient, specific engagement with the actual structure of the actual world. And when that engagement finally dissolved the gap between the practitioner and the practice, what remained was not a skill that could be described. What remained was a way of being present to the world that expressed itself in action, the way water expresses itself in the shape of the stone bowl, quietly, completely, without remainder. There is a passage in the Tao Te Ching where Lao Tzu writes about the valley spirit, the spirit of the low and hollow places that never dies. The valley is useful precisely because it is empty. The wheel is useful because of the hollow at the hub around which the spokes gather. The vessel is useful because of the space it does not fill. In each case, the absence is what enables the presence, the emptiness is what enables the function, and the thing that cannot be pointed to, the hollow, the gap, the open space, is the very thing without which the useful form collapses into inertness. Zhuangzi heard this, and heard it as a description of the interior state of the practitioner who has found Wo Wei, the hollow at the center, the cleared space where the self's agenda once stood. Ding moves his cleaver through the cavities that the ox's own nature has already made. The practitioner who has found Wo Wei moves through the world through the cavities that the world's own nature has already made, and which can only be entered when the practitioner has stopped insisting on a path that is not already there. Water in a low stone bowl on an autumn afternoon is a quiet thing to look at. It is not doing anything that would catch the eye of someone walking past with a purpose. It is simply there, holding the shape of the bowl, reflecting the light, keeping the stone it rests on slightly cooler than the stone around it. It is not trying to accomplish any of these things. It is not trying at all. And in not trying, in the complete absence of insistence, in the perfect willingness to be shaped by whatever contains it, and to settle into whatever space presents itself, it is more completely itself than anything that has been forced into a form not its own. The philosopher who walks past it in a hurry on his way to a debate about the nature of virtue will not notice it. The carpenter going to examine promising timber will not stop for it. The official carrying the prince's orders through the city will pass it without slowing. None of them are wrong to pass it. They have places to go and things to accomplish, and the stone bowl of water asks nothing from them and offers nothing to their purposes, but it is there. It was there before any of them arrived, and will be there after all of them have gone. It takes the shape of the bowl without argument. It settles toward the lowest point without being told. Over years and decades and centuries, the stone beneath it will be slightly changed by the long patience of its presence in ways no one will notice and no one will name. The water will not know that it has done this. There is no self in the bowl to know. There is only the water being water, in the way that Ding's hands are finally only the hands of someone who has spent a very long life learning how to follow. Wo Wei is not something arrived at quickly. This is perhaps the most important thing to keep alongside it, the qualifying truth that prevents the concept from becoming merely an elegant permission to stop trying. The cook who no longer has to think is the cook who thought, once, about every cut, who failed and corrected and returned and practiced until the thinking was inside the hands rather than outside them, until the knowledge had moved from the mind's explicit keeping into the body's wordless knowing. The stillness of the cicada catcher required years of clay balls before the forest would hold him as part of itself. What Wo Wei describes is not the beginning of a practice. It is where the practice goes, given enough time and enough genuine attention. It is the condition on the far side of effort, which can only be reached through effort, the way the swimmer must enter the water before the water can teach the swimmer how to move within it. The apparent ease of the master is not the absence of the long journey behind it. It is the form the journey finally takes when it has arrived at its own nature, when the distance between the practitioner and the practice has been closed down to nothing, and what remains is simply this: the blade following the grain, the pole resting in the morning air, the man in the current moving with the current, and the kitchen going quiet. In the long, patient life of this idea, across centuries and the many different contexts to which Zhuangzi's text was carried, what endures is not the argument. Arguments can be written down and put away. What endures is the image, the cleaver at rest, the knife that does not dull, the space at the hub of the wheel without which the wheel cannot turn. That space has no name that can be pointed at. no visible form that can be measured or assessed or praised. It is simply what it is, absence in the shape of usefulness, openness in the form of function, the nothing that makes the something possible. To hold it lightly is to be held by it, in the way that water is held by the bowl without being diminished or constrained by the bowl, each enabling the other's nature, neither arguing with what the other is, and in that holding, that mutual and effortless accommodation, the work is done. The ox is opened, the cicadas come, the prince goes quiet, and somewhere in a stone bowl in an autumn garden, in a low place at the edge of what is noticed, water rests in the shape it has been given, moving without insisting, present without announcing itself, the most alive form of presence being the one that has released the need to be recognized as present. Zhuangzi is lying on a sleeping mat in a modest room, and the light has not yet decided what it is. It is the particular light of very early morning, not dark, not day, something between the two, that has no name in the language of useful things. He has been dreaming. He knows this the way the body knows it before the mind arrives to confirm it. A slow warmth in the chest, a slight heaviness in the limbs, the sense of having been somewhere that the room around him cannot account for. In the dream, he was a butterfly, not watching a butterfly, not imagining one. He was the butterfly, completely, without remainder, moving through whatever space a butterfly moves through, aware of nothing that a butterfly would not be aware of, held in the fullness of a butterfly's world, without any surplus of selfhood left over to observe it from the outside. And then he woke. He is lying still, because to move too quickly now would be to decide something before the question has fully formed. The question is not difficult to state. It is difficult to hold. Was he a man who had been dreaming he was a butterfly, or was he now a butterfly dreaming he was a man? The room around him, the mat, the low table, the thin line of gray light at the window, presents itself as evidence, but evidence is only as reliable as the framework used to read it, and it is precisely that framework that the question is asking about. The categories are present: man, butterfly, waking, dreaming, real, imagined. They are available, ready to be applied. The mind reaches for them the way a hand reaches for a familiar tool. But something in the quality of that between light holds him still for another moment, and in that moment the categories float above him like objects that belong to someone else, and the question remains open, and the openness is not uncomfortable. It is, if anything, something very close to rest. This moment, not the dream itself, but the specific instant of waking after it, is where Zhuangzi plants his deepest philosophical argument. He does not argue that the categories are wrong. Exactly. He does not argue that there is no difference between being a man and being a butterfly, or between waking and dreaming. He lets the question itself do the work, because the question, genuinely held rather than quickly dismissed, reveals something that the categories had been quietly concealing, that the framework organizing experience, self and other, human and animal, real and imagined, is a framework, not a fact about the world. It is, as Zhuangzi would come to describe it, a perspective, and every perspective, no matter how familiar, no matter how reinforced by habit and social agreement, is partial. It is a view from somewhere, not a view from everywhere. The man lying on the mat sees what a man lying on a mat can see. The butterfly in the dream knew what the butterfly knew. Neither vantage point on its own contains the whole of what there is to contain. The second chapter of the Zhuangzi, which scholars call the Discourse on the Equalization of Things, the Qiu Wu Lun, is Zhuangzi's most sustained attempt to think this through. It begins not with an argument, but with an image, which is fitting for a philosopher, who distrusted the pretension of argument to deliver what only experience can provide. The image is of wind moving through the earth, through the 10,000 hollows of the land, through caves and crevices, and the channels between rocks. Each hollow has its own shape, and from each shape a different sound emerges: a long moan, a sharp whistle, a low hum, a quick chirping. The wind is the same wind. The sound is different in every case, shaped by the hollow it moves through, and no one hollow is producing the correct sound. No one voice is closer to the truth of the wind than any other. Each one is what happens when this particular wind meets this particular shape, and the music of all of them together, the vast, layered, uncoordinated music of 10,000 different voices, is the closest thing to a picture of reality that Zhuangzi thinks honest language can draw. This is what he means by perspectivalism, though the word itself is much newer than his thought. The view from here is not wrong. It is simply the view from here. The mushroom that lives for only a single morning does not know the alternation of day and night, not because the mushroom is ignorant, but because the mushroom's life does not extend across the threshold where that alternation becomes available as a fact. The chrysalis that lives only through a single season does not know the difference between spring and autumn. And the pengbird, that mythic creature whose wings are like clouds, and whose single wing beat carries it 90,000 li, looks down at the horizon and understands that what appears from below to be the limit of the world is not a limit at all, just the edge of a particular scale of seeing. The mushroom is not wrong to experience the morning as complete. The chrysalis is not wrong to find one season whole. The person on the ground is not wrong to find the horizon real. But each of them, if pressed to say that their experience is the final account of things, would be making a claim they cannot support from the position they occupy. Zhuangzi is not saying from this that all perspectives are equally good for all purposes. He is saying something quieter and harder to disagree with, that the attachment to any single perspective as the final account of reality is itself the source of a particular kind of confusion, and that this confusion is not primarily intellectual. It is felt. It is the feeling of needing to be right, of needing the boundaries between categories to be fixed and unchallengeable, of needing the man on the mat to be fully, finally, permanently distinguishable from the butterfly in the dream. The confusion Zhuangzi is pointing at is not a logical error. It is an orientation of the self toward the world, a grasping orientation, a measuring orientation, the orientation of the carpenter who walks past the great tree because his framework of value has nothing to say about it. In the same chapter, Zhuangzi stages a small strange scene, penumbra questioning shadow, and shadow questioning light. The penumbra, the half-shadow at the edge of a shadow, asks shadow why it keeps changing, why it sometimes stands and sometimes sits, sometimes moves and sometimes stops. Shadow says, I wait on something else. Whatever I wait on, itself waits on something else. And the scene stops there, without resolution, because the resolution would miss the point. Each viewpoint depends on conditions it did not create. The shadow does not choose its own shape. It waits on the object that casts it. The penumbra does not choose its own presence. It waits on the shadow. The light does not choose its own source. The search for a perspective that is finally completely self-grounding, that depends on nothing, that sees without being shaped by what it sees through, is not a search that has a destination. It is the conceptual equivalent of following a river upstream, expecting to find the place where the water begins. The water began everywhere. The river is already the answer to the question. What Zhuangzi proposes instead, and this is where his philosophy parts company with nihilism, which would simply shrug and conclude that nothing matters if all perspectives are partial, is that there is something that holds all perspectives equally without collapsing them into uniformity. He calls it the Tao, not the Tao as a thing, not as a doctrine, not as a principle that can be extracted and examined in isolation, the Tao as the name for whatever it is that allows 10,000 different sounds to coexist without any of them being wrong. The Tao is the ground from which each perspective grows and to which each returns, the way each hollow in the earth is part of the same landscape, even as each one produces its own sound. From the standpoint of the Tao, the mushroom's morning and the ping bird's 90,000-leaf flight are equally real. The carpenter's judgment of the useless tree and the tree's own slow self-knowledge are both genuinely present. The difference is that the Tao does not insist on any one of these as the final account. It holds them all, the way a landscape holds all the weather that has ever moved through it. Scholars who have spent long years with this text describe Zhuangzi's position as epistemological humility, grounded in a positive metaphysics. The phrase is careful and useful. It is not skepticism in the full, corrosive sense, not the view that knowledge is impossible, that nothing can be known, that all frameworks are equally groundless and equally arbitrary. It is something more like the recognition that knowledge is always knowledge from somewhere, and that the somewhere shapes the knowing in ways that cannot be entirely removed, only acknowledged. The wise person, the one who has allowed the butterfly dream to do its work, rather than immediately reasserting the man's identity over it, holds their own perspective as one perspective among many, with genuine awareness of its partiality, without therefore dismissing it as worthless. The goal is not to escape perspective, which would be impossible. The goal is to stop confusing the view from here with the view from everywhere. This same philosophical movement shows up in what Zhuangzi says about knowledge itself, not just perceptual knowledge, not just the question of what the butterfly dream means, but the deeper question of what it means to know anything at all, and how the forms of knowing that organized societies tend to celebrate compare to the forms they tend to overlook. The parable of Cook Ding, who moves his knife through the ox's body without resistance, following the animal's own inner architecture, is sometimes read as a story about skill. It is also a story about knowledge, about the difference between knowledge held in the mind as information and knowledge held in the hands as attunement. The cook has not simply memorized the structure of an ox. He has, through long practice, internalized that structure in a way that precedes conscious thought. When the knife moves, it moves through an understanding so deep that the conscious mind is not running it. The conscious mind, at the moment of greatest mastery, steps back, it watches. What carries the work forward is something older and quieter than analysis. Zhuangzi presents this as the highest form of knowing, not because explicit knowledge is worthless, but because the deepest knowledge, the knowledge that is most fully absorbed into the life and action of the one who holds it, is pre-verbal, somatic, and relational. It is the knowledge of the hollow responding to the wind, not the knowledge of the cartographer who has drawn a map of where the wind goes. Both have value, but the cartographer's map is an abstraction from the hollow's direct experience, and at a certain depth, abstractions begin to produce the confusion they were meant to resolve, begin to make the map seem more real than the landscape, begin to make the category seem more solid than the thing it was built to describe. The cook's knife does not have a theory of ox anatomy. It has something better, a lived familiarity that has outgrown the need for theory. There is a figure in a later chapter of the Zhuangzi, the wheelwright peon, who is working at his craft below the hall, where a prince is studying the words of the sages. Puen sets down his tools and asks the prince what he is reading. The words of the sages, the prince says. Are those sages still alive? Puen asks. No, they are dead. Then says the wheelwright, what the prince is reading is nothing more than the dregs and leavings of those men. He tries to explain. When shaping a wheel, the pressure must be just right. Too light, and the wheel won't fit snugly. Too heavy, and it won't move freely. The exact point between too light and too heavy, that is something Puen's hands know, and his mouth cannot say. He has not been able to teach it to his own son. It has lived in him for decades and will die with him. What the sages knew about virtue, about the Tao, about the right way to inhabit a life, that too was a kind of wheel knowledge. It lived in them. The texts are what survived the loss of the living knowledge, and to mistake the text for the knowledge is to mistake the dregs for the wine. This is not a dismissal of language. Zhuangzi wrote at tremendous length, and the text that carries his thought, at least its innermost, most securely attributable chapters, is among the most literary and inventive philosophical writing the ancient world produced. He knew what language could do. He also knew what it could not do, which may be why he chose fable over argument, image over proposition, parable over treatise. The form was itself a philosophical statement, that honest communication about reality is always oblique, always pointing past itself, always arriving at the edge of what words can reach, and gesturing at what lies beyond that edge. He described this with a term, zaiyan, which is sometimes translated as goblet words. The goblet is full, and then it tips, and then it rights itself and is filled again. The words mean this, and then they tip toward meaning something else, and then they find a temporary stability and tip again. Language is most honest, in this view, when it acknowledges that it is tipping, when it does not pretend to have fixed the meaning finally in place, does not mistake the full goblet for the permanent state of things. A goblet word does not make a claim and defend it to the end. It makes a gesture, holds it lightly, allows it to be overturned by the next gesture, and finds its way back to a temporary resting place before tipping again. This is the rhythm of the Zhuangzi itself, the fable that seems to say one thing and then opens toward another, the parable that contains its own questioning, the dream that dissolves just as the waking mind arrives to interpret it. The philosophical content and the literary form are not separable. The form is the argument that genuine thinking is not the accumulation of fixed truths, but the patient, recurring practice of tipping, writing, tipping again, following the motion wherever it leads. What makes a mind capable of this kind of tipping without losing itself is something Zhuangzi describes in other terms in the same chapter, where the carpenter encounters the tree, the fasting of the mind, the shinjai. It is a difficult concept to approach directly, which is perhaps why Zhuangzi places it in the context of a practical conversation about how to survive in a difficult political situation. The instruction offered is this: empty the mind of its fixed opinions, its certainties, its grip on the categories it has inherited and reinforced through habit, not to fill that emptiness with different certainties. Simply to become empty, hollow, like the tree, like the wind holes in the earth, like the hub of the wheel that does nothing and makes everything else possible. The mind that has released its grip on its own conclusions is not a weaker mind. It is a mind that can hear what could not be heard while the grip was tight. It is the carpenter asleep, the purposeful structure relaxed, the space opening where the tree can speak. There is a way of reading this that sounds like an instruction to become thoughtless, to abandon discernment, to dissolve into the flow of things and make no distinctions at all. This reading misses the direction the philosophy is pointing. The fasting of the mind is not the abolition of the mind. It is the refinement of it, the gradual clearing away of the opinions that were never genuinely the mind's own, the judgments inherited from social conditioning and instrumental habit, the accumulated weight of being useful in the way a pear tree is useful, always being shaped and pruned towards someone else's purpose. What remains after the fasting is not nothing. What remains is attention, unhurried and undefended, able to meet what is actually there, rather than what the categories say should be there. It is the attention of the cook whose knife finds the space that was already present in the animal's form. It is the attention of the hollow that does not choose its sound, but becomes fully what the wind and its own shape together make. The great pangbird of Chapter 1 knows something that the mushroom of a morning cannot know, that scale changes everything, that what appears from below to be the limit of the sky is not the sky's limit, but the viewer's. And yet the mushroom is not diminished by this. The mushroom's morning is complete in itself. The knowledge proper to the mushroom's scale is genuine knowledge, accurate and whole within its own dimensions. What Zhuangzi is asking for, the thing the butterfly dream asks for, the thing the goblet words ask for, the thing the fasting of the mind is preparing the ground for, is not the rejection of the mushroom's knowledge in favor of the pangbird's. It is the ability to hold both at once, to know that the mushroom is right and the pangbird is right, and that these two rightnesses do not cancel each other out, but belong to the same landscape, the same wind, the same movement of things through things. To hold that knowledge without needing either the mushroom's scale or the bird's to be declared finally, permanently, universally correct. This is the equalization that the chapter's title points toward, not the flattening of difference, not the collapse of all distinctions into a uniform gray. The equalization of the standing of different perspectives, the recognition that each one is genuinely present, genuinely real within its own reach, and genuinely partial in a way that does not diminish it. The wind does not correct the hollow, it moves through it and makes music. The philosophy does not correct the perspective, it holds it lightly, aware of where it reaches and where it stops. Shadow sat at the edge of light and waited, not knowing what it waited on. Penumbra sat at the edge of shadow and waited, knowing even less. Light fell from somewhere, carrying no explanation of itself. And the small scene in the ancient text sits there still, more than 2,000 years after someone set it down, tipping, writing, tipping again, never quite resolving, never quite disappearing, asking its question in the way a hollow asks a question, by becoming exactly the shape through which whatever comes next will pass. Zhuangzi woke from the butterfly dream, and the light in the room was changing, and the question was still open. He would have known, because this knowing was the kind that lived in the hands and the attention, rather than the conscious argument, that the question being open was not a problem requiring solution. The open question, held without grasping, without the urgency of needing it resolved before the morning properly arrived, is the thing the mind needs most and finds most difficult to allow. To sit with not knowing, not in defeat, not in suspended judgment, waiting for better information, but in genuine, settled, unhurried companionship with the question, is the fasting of the mind at its most complete. It is the mind become hollow. It is the wheelwright's hands at rest, after the wheel is finished, the knowledge still in them, nowhere to go, needing nowhere to go. There is something in the specific quality of pre-dawn light that understands this without being told, that neither dark nor day quality that holds two states at once without deciding between them. The light itself is doing what Zhuangzi's philosophy asks of the mind. not collapsing into one thing, not insisting on resolution, just being what it is in this moment, which is between and genuine and sufficient. The butterfly was there, fully present. The man was there, fully present. The transformation of things, the wuhua, is what Zhuangzi names the movement between them, and by giving it a name that acknowledges rather than resolves the mystery, he performs exactly the gesture the goblet word is designed to perform. Here is something real. I cannot fully say what it is. I am pointing past the edge of what saying can reach, and the pointing is the most honest thing I can do with language. The word tips. It writes itself. It holds the wine for a moment. And then the moment continues, and the wine spills gently, and what remains is the image of a man lying still, in changing light, both things at once, neither needing to be more or less than they are, resting in the full sufficiency of an open question held in an open mind. The mind that has fasted long enough to become hollow does not feel empty in the way that loss feels empty. It feels open in the way that the wind holes feel open, available, resonant, ready to become musical when the wind finds them. The man on the mat, lying still while the morning decides what it is not missing anything. The question floating above him, not yet resolved, not yet dismissed, is not a gap in understanding, but the understanding itself in its most alive form. To know that one perspective is a perspective, to carry that knowing lightly, without the weight of needing to be the final account, to hold the mornings between light as its own genuine state, not as failed daylight, and not as lingering dark, but as the thing it actually is. This is what Zhuangzi's second chapter, for all its density and strangeness, is quietly trying to hand over. The goblet tips. Not all the wine spills. It rights itself and sits, full again for a moment, in the still and unhurried dark. A mind willing to hold its knowledge this way, not gripping it, not demanding that it stay fixed in the position it was last assigned, but carrying it the way the hollow carries the wind's sound, openly, with its own shape, and without insisting on the result, is not a mind that has given something up. It is a mind that has stopped spending itself on the effort of keeping the categories in place. And that particular effort, once released, leaves something behind in the space it was occupying. Not a new opinion, not a better framework, something more like the quality of the between light, present, genuine, and asking nothing. The great tree at the shrine is still standing in the grove. The carpenters have all walked past it. The apprentice has stood still for a moment and looked up, and then walked on. The tree does not know that it is being spared, because it was never waiting to be harvested. It is not strategizing. It is not managing its own appearance for the benefit of observers. It is simply occupying the full reach of its own nature, its gnarled form, its unhelpful wood, its vast and unharvested age, and in that occupying, in that complete and unstrained presence to its own particular being, it has outlasted every useful tree in the forest. The hollow center of its trunk does nothing. The pithy wood serves no carpenter. The shade covers ground that no farmer has claimed, and the wind moves through its highest branches and makes a sound that no instrument was designed to make, particular to this tree and this wind and this moment. Not beautiful because beauty is useful, not useful because usefulness has nothing to do with it, just real, in the fullest sense of real, that Zhuangzi's philosophy points toward, present without apology, and meeting the wind with everything it has. The goblet of words tips and rights itself, and holds the question still, and the question rests, open, in the mind that has finally grown still enough to hold it without spilling it, resting now in its own most alive and unheld openness. The great tree stands at the shrine in the early morning, before anyone has come to look at it, The carpenter has gone. The apprentice has gone. The apprentice has gone. The road that runs past the shrine is empty, and the light is the particular gray gold light of an hour when the world has not yet decided what kind of day it means to be. The tree does not notice the light. It does not wait for the carpenter to return or for the apprentice to come back with his mouth open and his neck craned upward. Its roots hold it in the earth. Its branches hold the air. The leaves, 10,000 of them, are breathing in a way that has no name for breathing, doing what they do in the stillness of a morning that belongs entirely to them. This is where the parable ends, and also where it opens into something larger than a parable. The tree did not change during the night. It has not been altered by the fact that a man dreamed of it, that arguments passed through the carpenter's sleeping mind like water through hollows in stone, that somewhere in the dark of a modest dwelling, a craftsman turned on his sleeping mat, with something loosening in him he would not be able to name by morning. The tree is exactly what it was. Its bark is the same rough gray. Its branches curve in the same ungainly, ungovernable directions that made a carpenter's eye pass over it without pausing. The hollow at its center, the pithy wood that would make it useless for any beam or plank, is still hollow, and the tree is still standing, as it has stood for more than a century, as it will stand for another century, and more if the rains come and the soil holds, which there is every reason to believe they will. A life that cannot be spent does not diminish. This is the first thing the tree knows that the carpenter does not. There is a word in Chinese, asterisk d asterisk, that points at something difficult to hold in translation. It is sometimes rendered as virtue, sometimes as power, sometimes as the inherent potency of a thing. But these translations all carry the faint suggestion of something moral or deliberate, and asterisk d asterisk is neither. It is closer to the expression of the Tao in a particular form, the way a river is fully itself in its particular channel, the way a stone is fully itself in its particular weight and grain, the way a life is most fully alive when it is most completely what it is, rather than what some other standard requires it to be. In Zhuangzi's gallery of useless beings, the great tree has accumulated asterisk deeperage, asterisk the way a valley accumulates water, not by striving to be deep, but by being low, by remaining, by not being drained. The useful tree is asked to give and give and give. The pear gives its fruit, the orange gives its rind and pulp and the sweetness its careful gardeners have cultivated over generations. The citron bends under the weight of what it produces, and is stripped, and bends again, and is stripped again, until the stripping itself becomes the condition of its existence. This is what it means, in Zhuangzi's frame, to be celebrated. To be celebrated is to be spent. To be admired for one's qualities is to have those qualities extracted, refined, put to use, and called back for more. The useful life is the life that runs toward its own diminishment, because the world has learned to want what it has, and does not stop wanting. The great tree at the shrine has never been asked for anything, and so its asterisk de asterisk accumulates, year after year, decade after decade, undiluted and untapped, building in it the way something builds in a person who has been allowed to simply be what they are for long enough that they no longer remember what it cost them not to be something else. Not through effort, not through the cultivation of virtue, or the practice of moral exercise, or the memorization of the rites, through the simple and demanding practice of remaining, of continuing, as the tree continues in the full expression of its particular form, losing nothing because nothing has been taken. Zhuangzi was not a simple thinker, and the useless tree is not a simple image. Alongside the tree's patient self-defense, there stands another concept, one that works from the inside rather than the outside, that describes not the tree's strategy, but the mind's corresponding condition. In Chapter 4 of the Zhuangzi asterisk, in the same cluster of writings that contains the carpenter's dream, there appears the idea of angjai asterisk, the fasting of the mind. Not a physical fast, not the abstention from food or pleasure that other traditions prescribe as preparation for wisdom, a clearing of the mind's own holdings, the fixed opinions, the settled hierarchies of value, the habitual certainties about what is useful and what is not, what is large and what is small, what matters and what can safely be set aside. The hollow interior of the useless tree is the physical image of what sinjai describes in the mind. The tree that cannot be used for timber is the tree whose center is empty, porous, unsolid, offering nothing for the carpenter's purposes. And this is precisely the quality that has allowed it to grow vast, to stand centuries, to accumulate in its girth and canopy and root system a presence that no useful tree in the surrounding forest can approach. The emptiness is not absence, it is the condition that made everything else possible. A mind that has fasted from its fixed categories is not a mind that has been emptied of experience or intelligence or care. It is a mind that has stopped insisting on one arrangement of what it knows, that has released the grip of the framework long enough to find that the world ungrasped is larger than the framework ever suggested. The Zhuangzi asterisk does not prescribe a technique for achieving this. It offers instead a gallery of images, the useless tree, the fasting mind, the cook whose blade finds the space already in the animal, the cicada catcher whose stillness is so complete that insects land on his extended pole without fear. Each image points at the same quality from a different angle. None of them is the thing itself. The thing itself cannot be pointed at directly, and this too is part of what the Zhuangzi asterisk is trying to say. In the long years after the carpenter's dream, the tree goes on. Spring arrives, and the roots draw up what the soil has been holding through the cold months. The canopy opens, the leaves return in their 10,000s. Summer comes, and the shade the tree casts, the shade that once covered thousands of oxen, if the parable is to be read with its old numerical abundance intact, moves slowly across the ground beneath, following the sun from east to west, falling on nothing in particular, and serving nothing in particular, and being, for that reason, available to anything that comes, the bird that lands in the upper branches, the small creatures that move among the roots, the air itself moving through the leaves, in the particular way that this tree's particular configuration of branches permits, and not quite any other tree's branches would allow. This is what the tree offers, not use, not production. Not the sweet yield that earns a tree its reputation in an orchard. It offers shade that belongs to no one, a canopy that asks nothing of what shelters beneath it, a presence so complete and so ungrasping that it becomes, in time, the kind of presence that people name sacred without quite knowing why, only feeling that something in the vicinity of this tree has been allowed to be itself for so long and so thoroughly that the space around it has taken on a quality of permission, of rest, of the deep ease that accompanies things that are not trying to be other than what they are. Zhuangzi understood something about the way this kind of presence works. He had spent his adult life in the vicinity of courts and philosophers and competing accounts of how civilization should be ordered, and he had declined, as Sima Chan recorded, to enter any of them. Not from bitterness, not from contempt. The text suggests something quieter and more careful than either, a recognition that the role would require him to become something other than what he was. and that what he was had its own form and weight, and in the Daoist sense, its own asterisk to asterisk, a potency that would be diluted rather than expressed by the performance of social usefulness. He chose what looked, from the outside, like diminishment. He remained in the state of song, in a condition that was closer to poverty than to comfort. And he wrote, if he wrote the inner chapters, which is the careful scholarly understanding, in a form he called asterisk, yuan asterisk, spillover words, the words that exceed the container, the words that know they are inadequate to what they are pointing at, and choose that inadequacy, honestly rather than pretending to a precision they cannot achieve. He knew that the tree he was describing in fable could not be captured in argument. He knew that the quality of mind he was gesturing toward could not be produced by following a set of instructions. He offered instead the fable form, the form that announces its own limitations, that asks to be felt rather than analyzed, that delivers its meaning by a route that bypasses the waking, purposeful, categorizing mind and arrives somewhere else entirely. It arrives in the dark, sometimes. It arrives when the mind is quiet enough to receive it. Sleep, held in the light of the asterisk's Zhuangzi. Asterisk is not the suspension of consciousness. It is the suspension of the consciousness that categorizes, judges, assigns utility, and moves through the world as though the world were a set of problems awaiting solution. In sleep, the carpenter's eye closes. The framework of use that had him striding past the great tree without slowing his pace goes quiet, and in that quiet, the tree can speak. Not because the tree is magical, not because dream consciousness grants access to supernatural truths, but because the mind in sleep has released the grip of its waking assumptions long enough to hold the question that the waking mind perpetually forecloses. What is the world doing, aside from waiting to be used? Zhuangzi answered this question in the only way it can be answered, not with a proposition, but with an image. The tree is standing, the butterfly is flying, the ox lies along the blade's path in its own natural order. The water finds the lowest place, as water always does, without deliberation and without the slightest trace of effort in the arriving. These images do not add up to a doctrine. They point at something the doctrine would by its very precision obscure. The scholar and philosopher Jenny Odell, writing in a very different time and from a very different position, noticed something that rhymes with what Zhuangzi was pointing at, though Odell approached it from the question of attention rather than from Taoism as such. In her thinking about what it means to refuse the logic of productivity, to remove oneself from the demand that every moment be purposive, every capacity be leveraged, every quality be extracted and put to use, she arrived at a description of something like what the useless tree enacts. The refusal of instrumentality is not, she found, a withdrawal. It is a form of presence. It is the recovery of the kind of attention that the logic of use had been steadily consuming, the kind of attention that can rest on a thing without wanting anything from it, that can be with the world rather than working on it. Zhuangzi would have recognized this, perhaps with the faint amusement that the asterisk Zhuangzi asterisk often carries, the humor of a mind that has seen the same truth arrive by many different roads and has stopped being surprised that it keeps arriving. The useless tree is the tree that has kept its attention, not in the sense of vigilance, in the sense of remaining fully present to its own being, undrained, undiverted, entirely here. The hollow at the tree's center deserves its own moment of stillness, because it is so easy to read it as deficiency, and so important to read it otherwise. A hollow is a space. A space is an opening. An opening is the condition of possibility. the condition under which things can enter, can move, can take the shape of what is being offered. The wheelwright Pian in chapter 13 of the asterisk Zhuangzi asterisk speaks to Prince Hui about the knowledge in his hands, the knowledge of how much pressure to apply to the chisel, how much to ease it, the knowledge that lives in the specific responsiveness of 30 years of shaping wood and cannot be extracted from those years and handed to his son in a text or a set of principles. He calls it something that has no name. The prince has been reading the words of the old sages, and Pian, with wood shavings on his clothes, and a politeness that does not quite conceal his honesty, tells him that what he is reading may be the dregs of men who died long ago, not because the sages were wrong, but because what they knew was not the kind of thing that survives transmission by language. The hollow at the tree's center is the space in which this unnamed knowing lives. It is what remains when the useful, the extractable, the communicable has been cleared away. It is not emptiness as deprivation. It is emptiness as the condition under which the Tao can move, as the empty hub of the wheel is the condition under which the wheel can turn, as the hollow of the vessel is the condition under which it can hold what is poured into it. Zhuangzi reached for this image in different forms throughout the inner chapters, returning to it from different angles, the way a thinker returns to the one thing they have understood most clearly, turning it in the light to see what the different angles reveal. The hollow tree, the fasting mind, the blade finding the space in the animal's own structure, the butterflies not knowing, hanging in the moment between the two identities. Each of these is the same figure in a different register. Each of them points at the condition in which the fixed, purposive, category-managing self has relaxed its grip enough to allow something else to be present. That something else does not have a name that survives translation well. The Tao is not a thing, not a force, not a god. It is, at most, the name for whatever it is that everything is doing when nothing is being imposed on it, the direction water takes when the obstacle is removed, the way the seed grows when the soil is right, the way a mind settles when the noise stops and the categories loosen, and the question of what everything should be doing is gently, without conclusion, set down, sitting at the edge of a river at dusk, not writing, not composing arguments, not thinking about what virtue requires or what the proper ordering of civilization demands. This is where Sima Chun's account of Zhuangzi does not take the reader, and it is also where, if the asterisk Zhuangzi asterisk is right about anything, the man himself most often was, not in the courts, not in the halls of philosophical debate, not performing the refusal of performance, which is its own kind of effort. Somewhere at the edge of things, watching water, doing nothing that would have made him useful to anyone who passed, useful to himself, perhaps, useful to the Tao in the way that all things are, without trying and without knowing it, and useful, much later, to the readers who would come to the asterisk, Zhuangzi asterisk across centuries and find in it, in its parable logic, in its gnarled imagery, in its deliberate refusal to conclude, something that the philosophical treatises of the same period could not provide, the sense that the world had room in it for a life that did not justify itself by its productivity, that the ungainly and the hollow and the unclassifiable had a place in the order of things that was not marginal, but in some sense the waking purposive mind could never quite argue its way to. Central. The great tree offers its shade to the morning. The light, strengthening now, moves through the upper canopy in the way it always has, bending around the branches, falling in broken patterns on the ground below. Nothing grows beneath the tree that could not grow in other shade. Nothing comes to the shrine that requires specifically this tree's protection. The pilgrims who come If they come, do not come for the tree's uses. They come because something in its presence has the quality of the very long, the very still, the very patient, the quality of something that has not been asked to be other than it is for so many decades that it has become, simply, entirely itself. And this is a thing that is difficult to be, perhaps the most difficult. The Confucian Project, the Mohist Project, the Legalist Project, each of them in different registers asked the human being to shape themselves towards something beyond their given form, to subordinate what they happen to be to what civilization or virtue or efficiency required them to become. Zhuangzi watched all of this from his position in song, and the asterisk Zhuangzi. Asterisk is, among other things, his account of what is lost in that shaping. The asterisk défi étoile, asterisk that drains away when the tree is pruned to produce more fruit. The knowledge that cannot survive being extracted from the hands that carry it. The quality of mind that is consumed by the effort to perform the quality of mind. What is left when none of this is asked of a thing? The tree is the answer. The tree is all wood and bark and hollow and shade and root, doing nothing that could be pointed to as an achievement, being nothing that could be cited as an example of the virtuous life, and standing, still standing, in the early morning light of a day that does not know yet what kind of day it means to be. The roots spread out beneath the surface of the ground in every direction, slowly, in the dark, without witnesses. This is the part of the tree no one sees. The canopy is visible from the road. The girth of the trunk can be measured, roughly by the joined arms of enough people. But the roots move through the soil in their own unhurried logic, following what moisture suggests and what density permits, finding the paths that have always been open because no one was using them for anything else. The roots do not know they are roots. They have no picture of what the tree looks like from above, no knowledge of the shade they are sustaining, no sense of the pilgrim who will pause beneath the canopy later in the afternoon and feel, without being able to explain it, that something here has been itself for a very long time. The roots simply extend. They extend because the tree extends, because the Tao extends through everything that is not being prevented from extending, because what is alive, given the conditions for life, continues not toward any destination, not in service of any telos, but in the direction that is available to it, which is also the direction that is most fully its own. The mind that is fasted from its categories, the tree that has cultivated its uselessness, the cook whose blade moves through what has always been open, they are all doing the same thing. They are extending in the direction that is available when nothing is being imposed. They are not progressing. They are not achieving. They are not building toward a moment of culmination that will justify everything that came before it. They are simply continuing the way the roots continue, in the dark, in the quiet, in the deep patience of a thing that does not need to arrive anywhere because it is already fully where it is. The asterisk Zhuangzi, asterisk ends, or rather the 7 inner chapters end, in the carefully scholarly understanding that treats the text as a composite of voices across time, not with a conclusion, but with more images, with parables that do not resolve, questions that remain open, figures who inhabit their uselessness with a contentment that the useful world, from the outside, cannot account for. Ko Shang, arranging the text in the 4th century, set it in the order that would persist. A.C. Graham, reading it in the 20th century, traced the different hands that had contributed to it, the different moments of composition, the different philosophical orientations that had, across generations, added their own angles to the image Zhuangzi had begun. The text survived, not because any regime found it useful. The Zhuangzi was not easily conscripted into the service of Confucian orthodoxy or legalist administration or any of the other projects that shaped Chinese civilization across the centuries. It survived, in part because it was ungovernable, because it slipped away from every attempt to summarize or systematize it, every attempt to extract from it a set of doctrines that could be applied with the confidence of instruction. It is a text in this way that embodies the quality of its most persistent image. It cannot be used as timber. It offers shade and strangeness and the sense of something very old being fully itself. And from that offering, it has outlasted almost everything that was, in its own time, considered more useful. The carpenter woke from his dream and went back to his work. History does not record what he made of the arguments the tree had given him, or whether the loosening in his assumptions held through the day, or whether the next tree he passed on the road received a slightly longer look before his professional gaze moved on. Perhaps none of this happened. Perhaps the dream dissolved in the ordinary morning the way dreams do, leaving only the faintest residue of something that had seemed important and could not quite be retrieved. The carpenter is not the point. He is the occasion. He is the purpose of mind that the dream requires in order to have something to speak to, and what happens to him afterward belongs to the life he returned to, which the parable does not follow. The tree does not follow him either. It stands where it has always stood. It is not waiting for the carpenter to understand it. It is not invested in the outcome of the dream. Its existence does not depend on being recognized. Its asterisk does not require a witness. The shade it casts in the afternoon is the same shade whether anyone pauses in it or not, whether anyone thinks to name it as anything other than shadow falling across dust. This is the final quality that makes the useless tree the figure Zhuangzi returned to, the image that gathered so much of what he was trying to say. Not its cleverness, not the sophistication of its self-defense in the carpenter's dream, but its complete indifference to being understood. It is not teaching. It is not withholding. It is simply being, in the full and undiluted sense of being, the sense in which the Tao itself simply is, without needing to explain itself, without needing to produce anything beyond the 10,000 things that move through it, like wind through the hollows. The morning light is fully gold now, arriving at an angle that reaches the ground beneath the canopy, only in long, thin threads between the branches. The air is still. The tree holds its position at the center of the shrine, as though position were the easiest thing in the world, as though standing in one place for a century were no more demanding than breathing, which it is not, which it is exactly like. There are people who wake early and walk past shrines like this one, on roads like this one, in the gray gold early morning of a world that is very old and very patient and entirely indifferent to the difference between the useful and the useless, the productive and the dormant, the celebrated and the overlooked. Some of them look at the tree, some of them do not. The tree does not distinguish. Its branches extend equally in all directions, as branches do. Its roots extend equally in all directions, beneath the surface, in the dark, without knowing they are extending. The ground holds everything that has stopped struggling against it.